I sing the power of the Lord each and every day, praising the Savior as I go on my way. By the blood of Jesus Christ now I say, I'm gonna walk the way that's straight, following the path that's straight and narrow is a much better place to be. Out of a life of sin, now full of pain and misery, I have the voice of Jesus say, why don't you come unto me? Now is the peace he promised.
Churches of Christ welcome you to our program today, Key to the Kingdom, and our lesson is entitled Lessons from Ahab.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today on Key to the Kingdom. I hope that you are enjoying this December, that wherever you are, the weather is tolerable. If you like to ski and do things that involve snow, I hope you have snow. And if you don't like to do those things, I hope you don't have snow if you don't want it. Of course, you know and I know that we take whatever we get, don't we? And we live in a great country where we can enjoy some outside activities that involve snow for those who like it. We come near to the end of a year, and as we come to the end of the year, it's good for us to review, to look over things that we have done and perhaps learn some lessons from it. Unfortunately, sometimes lessons that we learn are very painful. And so it's helpful for us if we can learn lessons from somebody else. If we can learn some truth that we can apply to our life, to help us in our life to live better, to enjoy life more, to be more confident, to be more comfortable, to be more at ease. If we can learn some of these lessons from someone else, it can be very helpful for us. And that's one of the reasons that God gave us His book, the Bible, so that we could read of the events that happened, that we could read of some people, and that we could learn some lessons that they have taught us by things that they experienced in their life. Today, I'd like for us to focus a few moments on the life of a man by the name of Ahab. Now, Ahab was not just anybody. He was a king. And as a king, of course, he had considerable power. He was blessed, and I use that word advisedly and put it in parentheses. He was blessed with a wife. Now, you'll understand why I put that in parentheses when I tell you that his wife was Jezebel. And if you know anything about his story, you know that Jezebel was a very, very strong-willed and rather vindictive woman. But one thing that you have to say about Jezebel is that she appears to love her husband. But unfortunately, that love does some bad things. If you want to open your Bible to the Old Testament book of 1 Kings, we'll look at some things that transpired in the life of Ahab. 1 Kings chapter 21, and we'll begin at verse 1. Sometime later, there was an incident involving a vineyard belonging to Naboth the Jezreelite. The vineyard was in Jezreel, close to the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Ahab said to Naboth, "Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it's worth." Now here, you see that Ahab wants to make a business deal. He's got this neighbor who lives close to him, or at least his vineyard is close to him. And he'd like to have it for a vegetable garden. And so he makes a proposition. And you have to admit, the proposition is fair. I'd like to have your vineyard for a vegetable garden. I'll tell you what I'll do. I will give you another vineyard. Or if you don't want that, I'll pay you what it's worth. Now, what better deal could the guy ask for? The only problem is that Naboth really didn't want to sell his vineyard. Not for any price. Let's go on reading at verse 3. But Naboth replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." So here you see Naboth says, this isn't just a possession that I bought a few years ago, but this is in the family. This was a possession of my fathers. This is part of our heritage as a family. So I don't want to sell it. Well, let's go on, verse 4. So Ahab went home, sullen and angry, because Naboth the Jezreelite had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." He lay on his bed, sulking, and refused to eat. Now, here you go. You've got this guy. He's a king. I mean, I said earlier, he's a somebody. You know, he's not just some guy. He's a king. He's a guy who has power. He wants this vineyard. Naboth doesn't want to sell it, and so what does he do? You know, he acts like a man? Well, hopefully not. He goes home, lays on his bed, and sulks because he didn't get what he wanted. Well, that's bad enough. But let's notice what happens next. Verse 5. His wife Jezebel came in and asked him, "Why are you so sullen? Why won't you eat?" He answered her, "Because I said to Naboth, 'Sell me your vineyard,' or if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard in its place." But he said, "I will not give you my vineyard." Jezebel, his wife, said, "Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." Well, she comes home and finds him. She says, "Don't you know who you are? Don't you understand that you're the king? So get up, clean up, eat, and I'll take care of this." Now, one thing you'll find out is Jezebel could do it. She had set her mind, and she was going to make sure that it was done. So again, let's read a little further, verse 8 beginning. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, placed his seal on them, and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. In those letters she wrote, "Proclaim a day of fasting and seat Naboth in a prominent place among the people. But seat 2 scoundrels opposite him and have them testify that he has cursed both God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death." So the elders and the nobles who lived in Naboth's city did as Jezebel directed in the letters she had written to them. What a tragedy. What a tragedy of power. I don't know if Ahab really felt comfortable about what his wife had done or not. I don't even know if he knew altogether what she had done. We will see a verse in a moment that might give us some indication that even if he didn't know it before it happened, he probably was not unhappy that it did take place, and perhaps would have given his seal of approval if, in fact, he had known beforehand. A very devious plan. We'll have a feast, and we'll put Naboth in a place of prominence, but we'll bring false accusations against him. And in the process, or as a result of that, we'll stone him to death. And then, of course, his vineyard will be free. And Ahab will get what he wants. Well, I mentioned a verse. Go on over in this 21st chapter and notice what it says about Ahab in verse 25. "There was never a man like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, urged on by Jezebel his wife." Never was a man like Ahab. Never was a man who was so determined to do what he wanted and to get what he wanted that he was willing to do wrong to accomplish it. But even worse, or at least equally as bad, was the fact that he had a wife who encouraged him in that activity. That he had a wife who was as bad or worse than he was. Now, as we look at this example of how Ahab dealt with a situation in his life, we need to recognize that it's an all too normal kind of emotion. Hopefully not, that you and I would go out and commit a crime, do something evil, take someone's life to get what we want. But understand that Ahab was dealing with a desire. He was dealing with something that he desired and coveted, something that he wanted. Now, his wife was willing to take the leadership and to go all the way to the point of taking a man's life, an innocent man who hadn't done anything to anybody, to go to the point of taking his life to get what her husband wanted. Now that's a terrible thing. But it does, I think, underline the problem that comes sometimes because of covetousness. This is one of the faults of Ahab that comes out. He was so desirous. He coveted so much the vineyard of Naboth that when he didn't get what he wanted through a reasonable proposition, he goes home and acts like a child and lays on his bed and pouts. And because of that desire, he was involved in and was led in and allowed at least to have sin take place. This is one of those sins that's there all the time. But when was the last time you heard anyone confess the sin of coveting? When was the last time that anyone said to you, you know, I have a problem in my life, and my problem is that I covet things. Sometimes things that I shouldn't have, perhaps, or certainly things that aren't mine to have. We don't do that. But we need to understand that covet can be a good thing. To covet something, to desire something, because that's basically what coveting means. If you go to the Greek there, it's simply the idea of wanting something, desiring something, having a desire for something. Look, for example, at Luke chapter 22. And in verse 15, as we hear Jesus himself speaking to his disciples, he's gathered with them in the upper room. They are partaking of the Passover feast. And out of this grows the institution of the Lord's Supper, or the communion, as we observe it today. And notice what Jesus says in verse 15. I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Jesus said that he had eagerly desired it. And that's basically the idea of coveting. He wanted something. He desired something. He was seeking for something. He had a real strong wish and desire for something. And so the word covet, the idea of coveting, may not be sinful necessarily. Let's look at another example in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Paul, in writing to this young preacher, Timothy, is wanting him to put the church in order in Ephesus. And so he says to Timothy, one of the things he's to do is to appoint elders in every church. The elders are those individuals who are appointed as the shepherds. They are the ones who oversee the work of the church according to Scripture. They are the ones who have responsibility for providing this leadership in the Lord's body, in the local congregation. Now, Timothy was to appoint. But the question is, who do you appoint? Well, in 1 Timothy 3, verse 1, he says, "Here is a trustworthy saying. If anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task." Again, the idea of coveting or wanting or desiring, that the individual is seeking something, that he is desirous of this position of leadership in the church. To understand that it's not a matter of necessarily being wrong because someone desires something. Now, could a man desire the office or the work? And I don't like to speak of the word or of bishops or elders, shepherds in a church. I don't like to speak of them as an office, because it's not really an office, it's a ministry. But would it be possible for a man to desire, to covet the office or the ministry of an overseer in a wrong way? Well, sure. If he is desiring it for his own personal gratification, if he is desiring it simply because he thinks he's going to put him in some sort of an elevated position. But if he desires that good work, it's a noble thing, as he understands that it in fact is a work, a ministry to be done, and he commits his life to doing it. So, the word covet or desire can be used and is used on occasion in a positive way. However, there are certainly negative ways that it's used. Let's look at 2 or 3. First, let's go to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. Here, as Jesus is teaching in this Sermon on the Mount, he talks about the matter of an individual who is desirous and covetous, who has a desire for something that he should not have and covets in a wrong way. Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now, in this teaching, Jesus begins it by saying, "You have heard it said that one should not commit adultery." Well, he carries it that step further. He says, understand that the desire, the coveting of someone who is not your wife or husband, to the degree that you think about them in an immoral way, that you think about having an immoral relationship with them, Jesus said, you've already sinned. You've already committed a sin in your heart. That you have had that desire and that covetousness that will get you into trouble. Indeed, as we look at this matter of the evil side of coveting, Paul in Romans 13, verse 9 says, "Do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself." Paul understood that we needed to get rid of those negatives in our life, those things that were bad. And one of those things that was bad is to covet in a way that brings about bad actions. That was the problem that Ahab had. Not that he desired his neighbor's vineyard, because he made a proposition to the neighbor to purchase it in a fair way. But that desire, with the help of his wife, became the source of evil. Paul, in Colossians chapter 3, reminds us in verse 8, "But now you must rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips." We must get rid of these things that are destructive, and these things that take us away from relationship to God. So as we look at Ahab, let's learn the lesson. The lesson is coveting can be a sin. And so as we look and behold things in this life, and as we are desirous of those things around us, help us to understand that we cannot take that which in some way or other violates God's law. And what is the law of God that we're violating? The law that says that we love our fellow man as we love ourselves. If what I do, if what I covet, what I desire, makes me do wrong to my neighbor, then it's a sin before God. Secondly, we recognize that Ahab gave in to temptation. Understand that we can be tempted. We can easily be tempted in our life. We can be tempted to do those things that are wrong. Not can be, we will be. All of us will be tempted. Every day we live, there will be those situations that we find ourselves in where we may feel like doing or saying or acting in some way that is just not correct and right before God. Temptation is going to be there. And sometimes we may be tempted by the desire for something, for some wealth or some particular blessing that we might get, some material thing that might come our way. As we face temptations, we have to learn to deal with them, to overcome them, and not let them control us. Let's go back to the Sermon on the Mount for a moment, because here in this great sermon, if you really want to be challenged in your Christian life, just spend some time reading the Sermon on the Mount. Understand the challenge of living a life that is spiritually based, that says, whatever I do, it must be to the glory of God. We'll go back to the section that we were reading a moment ago in Matthew chapter 5. And we read there the statement that Jesus made about coveting or desiring someone who was not our mate, someone to whom we were not married in a sexual way. He goes on, Matthew 5 verse 29 says, "If your right eye causes you to sin, gorge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." My, that's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? Here, what Jesus is saying is that if, because of temptation, you find yourself doing things with your eye or your hand that you ought not to be doing, get rid of them. Now, we could argue about whether or not Jesus literally meant to poke your eye out or cut your hand off. I personally believe that what Jesus was saying there was really an overstatement. I don't believe that Jesus was into self-mutilation. I don't believe that Jesus was really thinking that we ought to whack parts of our body off. Because understand, the seat of sin is the mind. Where does coveting come from? It comes from the mind. It comes from the mind because of what we see, the lust of the eye. From what we desire, the lust of the flesh. From ego, the vainglory of life. But these things come in our mind. It's our mind that's affected. I've always said that if a person had a right hand that caused them to sin and they whacked that hand off, they'd figure out how to sin with the stub that was left. Because you see, the problem is not the hand. The problem is the mind that controls the hand. But we'll be tempted. We'll be tempted to do those things, to say those things, to use our tongue in a negative way. And we need to learn the lesson. Ahab gave in to temptation. He acted like a baby, and so his wife, in frustration perhaps. Have you ever done that? Have you ever had a child who's kind of thrown a fit because they wanted something and they couldn't get it, and so you give in and give it to them because you didn't want to see them pout? Well, that's kind of the situation that we had here. Such terrible temptation, such terrible coveting, such a terrible result. How sad to be able to say about someone that they were just about as bad as they come. That's what the Lord said in 1 Kings 21, verse 25, about Ahab. Why? Because he gave in to the power of coveting, to the temptations that he went through, and his failure to stand up and be counted when the time came. May you and I understand that we can learn lessons from men like Ahab. And hopefully, as we learn those lessons, we will live more Christ-like. We will live closer to the Lord. We'll be able to honor Him by the things that we do. May God help you to deal with temptation in a positive, godly way every day of your life. We remind you of our Bible course that's available simply for the asking. If you will call the number that's on the screen and ask for it, we'll be happy to send it to you, and pray that as you study it, you'll come to understand and know even better how much the Lord loves you.
Each and every day, praising the Savior as I go on my way. By the blood of Jesus Christ,